Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Trauma Uncensored. I'm your host, Brooke Shearer. We've got another great episode for you today, which we will jump into shortly. If you're a regular listener of this podcast, thank you for your continued support. And if this is your first time listening, I'm so glad you found us. This podcast was created as a safe space for community, connection, resources, and support for anyone navigating trauma, grief, mental health, or pain. Here, your experiences are both valid and valued. Your story matters, and it's important to know you are not walking this path alone. It is my hope that each episode helps you feel more connected and reminds you that it is possible to not only live, but to truly thrive after hardship. Trauma Uncensored began as an extension of my own healing journey following immense trauma. The course of my life changed in the fall of 2015 and led to the tragic death of our 9-year-old son, Logan, in 2016 due to a distracted driver whose reckless choice behind the wheel led to the crash. In the time since Logan was taken from us, I have fought for my mental health and for my survival. That fight has led me down an unexpected path of discovery, healing, and recovery. It has given me the tools to sit here today and share these conversations with you. If you're new to the Trauma Uncensored podcast, I invite you to start with episode 1 titled The Crash. In that episode, I share the beginning of my story, which provides important context for the conversations and guest stories that follow. Speaking of guests, we believe our listeners' voices matter deeply, and we welcome those who wish to share their experiences. If interested, click on the submission link in our show notes below, email hello@traumauncensored.com, or reach out through any of our social platforms. Just be sure to include the word guest in your submission. All show information, resources, and links can also be found in the show notes. Be sure to follow us on our social media platforms and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. And if this podcast speaks to you, and I'm sure it will, we would truly appreciate you leaving a review. Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This podcast discusses topics related to grief, loss, trauma, mental health challenges, survival, and more. While I have gained deep personal experience in these areas, I am not a therapist, and this show is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. So stay tuned for another installment of Trauma Uncensored, where, as always, we're healing out loud.
Trauma Uncensored.
Trauma Uncensored.
Trauma Uncensored.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Trauma Uncensored. I am joined today by Elizabeth Boring, a licensed social worker and fellow in thanatology, which is the study of death, grief, and loss. Liz works with Riley Grief Services at Riley's Children's Health, where she supports children and families navigating the incredibly difficult experience of loss. Through her work, Liz helps families find stability and support during moments that can feel overwhelming, guiding them as they begin to navigate life after loss. A lot of the stories we share here on Trauma Uncensored involve loss in different forms. And because of your work, Liz, supporting grieving families and children, we're really grateful to have you on today. So, Liz, thank you so much for being here, for joining us, for sitting with me. And talking about your work, which personally I know is incredibly important as we have worked together. We worked together for a long time when I lived in Indianapolis. And talk about just such an amazing resource. I'm so grateful to have had you along in my journey. And we can talk more about those experiences as they might arise whenever we're going through everything. But I just want to personally send out my gratitude for what you do and for how you help people navigate such experiences. I've taken a lot of the work that you have taught me and taken it forward into my own journey and my own healing. I use the orbit metaphor quite a bit, and maybe you can help us understand the orbit metaphor while we're talking. But just a lot of the information that you have taught but not only that, but sharing the space, which I think was really important. Sharing space and allowing us to grieve and get angry and be sad and cry and share special moments. Something that is very near and dear to my heart, actually, would be the donuts that you would bring in for Logan on his birthday and his angel date when we'd come and see you. Just a small token of remembrance, but did so incredibly much to remind us that Logan is still, he's an is, right? Not a was, but that he is worth celebrating, even although he's passed. So again, my gratitude to you and to everybody listening. I just want you to know how much I love Liz, and she has
Oh,
just done so much for me. And I know that not just for me, you're doing so much for so many people. Um, and it's a resource that hopefully someday everyone can have access to. So again, Liz, welcome.
well, thank you. Also, thank you for your incredibly kind words.
Oh,
It
absolutely.
certainly is a privilege to get to walk alongside grieving families. And I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to get to talk with you and hopefully share a little bit of information for people who are also walking this journey or maybe wanting to support people who are walking this journey. So it's a beautiful opportunity. Thank you.
Absolutely. So, for let's start off by talking about thanatology, which has been something I've been having a hard time pronouncing this morning since we've been talking about it, but I think we've got it, or I think I finally got it down. So I know I am not familiar with the term. Most people, I would assume, are not familiar with the term, but you do have a fellow in thanatology. So, can you explain to us what that or the definition of thanatology, and what it means to be, what a fellowship looks like as well?
Sure, sure. So there is a professional organization called the Association for Death Education and Counseling, also known as ADEC, and they are the ones who issue credentials that are a certificate in thanatology and also a fellow in thanatology. And what it does is it is a credential that demonstrates a certain knowledge or expertise in the field of death, dying, and bereavement. So, certification in thanatology says you have pursued knowledge, you have acquired a certain amount of knowledge in this field, and you sit for a test and you gain your certification. A fellow in thanatology has to demonstrate that they have contributed to the field in some way. So they not only have acquired knowledge, but then they have also perhaps mentored students or taught classes. They have published or done research. So there's a higher level to prove that you have contributed to this field and you have a certain level of expertise. And once you've done that and passed the test, you can earn a fellow in thanatology.
Got it. So all of the work that you have done, and I know that you have done a lot of stuff outside of sitting in a chair in an office with clients or bereaved families. Um, because the thanatology is you providing services in grief and loss and experiences. What are some of the outside components to not just sitting in and working with bereaved families, but outside of the office? What are things that you have done that have would not have been possible without your fellowship?
Yeah, so, one of the things on my path to fellowship that was really important to me is providing education to people. So, in my graduate program of social work, was not required to take a grief and loss course. And most mental health professions do not require a grief and loss course in order to graduate with your master's degree, right? And that holds true today for social work. That's not a required course. And of course, I'm very biased because I'm very passionate about helping the bereaved, but that just doesn't sit well with me. If we think about the most common human experience people will have is that they will lose someone they care about.
Hmm.
We need mental health professionals. We need helping professionals that have some training and awareness of how to walk alongside someone who's grieving. I know this is something you have already talked about, but grief is not a mental health issue. Grief is the body's natural and instinctual way of coping with loss. Humans have been losing their babies and people they love since the beginning of time, for all of human history. We instinctually know how to cope with that. It is society and others who kind of interfere with that natural and instinctual process that causes confusion, it causes distress, it causes a lot of doubt. People will think, I'm not doing this the way I should be doing it, right? And I want to do my small part to change that experience for the bereaved. I know I can't touch every single grieving family. My hope is that providing education to other, mental health or community professionals, they then, right, it's a cascading effect.
Mhm.
They then can be a support for those individuals. So that's one piece of kind of what I was passionate about on my path to becoming a fellow in thanatology. I also know some of my colleagues who are really passionate about research and contributing to the literature. Up until the past 5 years, there was just nothing on bereaved parents in the literature. A lot of researchers were scared to touch that population. It came from good intentions, but it doesn't change the fact that we have an obligation not only to help people, but to do it in a competent way. And if we don't have the research and we don't have the information, people are going to do it in whatever way they think is best. And as you know, that's not always helpful.
No, I mean, and that's the thing is, um, you know, in the experience that, I've personally had, and you have definitely walked this with me. I mean, we were, spending time with you while we were active in the nonprofit, and, um, had it not been for the resources that we were actively choosing to engage in, right? I mean, the nonprofit broke me down anyway in ways that I could not have foreseen when I was telling the story over and over and over again in legislation and to the media and reliving that day on a constant basis. Um, but I can't imagine had we not existed in this realm of support with you. And I think we were going to see you once a week or once every couple of weeks, if I remember correctly. And, being able to just have that space to purge everything, a safe space to purge, which, is exactly what my goals are for this podcast, right? A safe space to tell your story, to purge, to not feel like you have to keep it in, like 5 years ago, wasn't a thing. Nobody was wanting to touch it. And that's actually one of the most important things that I have taken from you in all of these years was I did not realize the 5 years of the research that only in the past 5 years. And I'm sitting here thinking, we were still seeing you then, but that was towards the tail end of it because then COVID hit. Um, so we were seeing you in the pre-research stage, that people were starting to research it. But what always stuck with me, and I'm hoping you can actually explain, was kind of like this timeline of where grief was accepted and people expected it into when it became just something that was going to happen and people stopped talking about. Can you share with our listeners kind of that chronological shift, and we talk about it, it's there, and then all of a sudden, boom, we don't speak about it.
Yeah. So this is where the thanatology part of me will geek out. Um, so, I think about for all of human history until the mid 20th century, the most common cause of death was a communicable disease. So most humans throughout documented time died of illness, right? Some type of communicable disease. That's even to this day why we say bless you when someone sneezes, is because at one point in time, a sneeze was indicative that you were ill and could lose your life as a result of that. But then when we had the advent of antibiotics, immunizations, and better sanitation, human mortality, and specifically childhood mortality, drastically declined. We could suddenly prevent communicable diseases with sanitation and immunizations, and we could treat communicable diseases with antibiotics. For the first time in human history, we could prevent and treat the most common cause of death in humans, right? With that, people started living longer. With that, you were less likely to lose someone throughout your lifetime. So, where it was always common to have lost a child, right? Most families would have experienced the death of an infant or a child at some point in their parenting journey. It suddenly became less and less common, right? And as a result of that, people have less awareness, right? We don't know. My father in law, for example, he was in his 70s before he lost any significant person close to him, right?
Wow.
That's wild. That's
Mhm.
that's really impressive. It's also miraculous. Like, what a human achievement to be able to extend our lifespan, basically double it from the 1900s to today. But also be kind of shielded from such significant loss that almost all humans had experienced prior to this generation or these most recent generations. So, but I think as a result of not having those experiences, we just don't understand. We're not as empathetic. We're not as supportive, right? We fear what we don't know. We fear what we don't understand. And therefore, I feel like bereaved parents are a lot more isolated in some
Mm.
ways.
Mhm.
We also had that experience after World War II. So many people lost someone close to them in World War II. And then it shifted, and we really didn't talk about grief after that. It was like post World War II, we're, we won the war and we're going to focus on the good and move forward. And so there was this drastic shift in people discussing or talking about grief after that. And really, that persisted until the early 2000s. One of the things specifically for childhood grief that changed was 9/11.
Mm.
So when 9/11 happened, thousands of New York City public school children were all bereaved at the same time.
Mhm.
And researchers realized that was a really opportune moment to study how do these kids grieve? What support is helpful? How do we help them navigate? And the teachers didn't know what to do. Like, how do you support all these kids who have had a shared experience, right? So, a lot of research was done on those kids. We have really good data and information from that. And then when you take social media and kind of appreciate how it opened up access, I think we also had a shift there. So people could post things that maybe they couldn't say out loud, right? People could continue to honor their child in ways that maybe wouldn't feel as comfortable to them in person or with other people present. And if you have a child, for example, that dies of a rare disease, or for example, in your situation, a very traumatic situation, you may be in a group and not meet any parent who has a shared similar experience. But if you're on social media, you can find people from California, Canada, Ireland, right? You could find people from all over the world who maybe could say, like, I had a similar experience. And so it opened things up where I do think to some extent there's more conversation, a little more awareness. The part that disappoints me is that I don't think it's changed how others respond in a supportive way.
Agreed. And before we started recording, you had asked me what what encouraged me, right, to start the podcast. And it's one of those things, as you mentioned, parents can feel, or losing someone, you can feel so alone. You feel like you're the only person in the world who is going through this experience, especially if you aren't able to have shared experiences with people you're in groups with. And that's what we found. We found that, we were going to these groups for support, other people who had lost children, but I think there were only a couple people who had lost someone young like we did. Most of them were adults or maybe, infancy or miscarriage. And so nothing, preteen years. And nobody was, you know, talking about distracted driving. We didn't, we do know people now because of the work that we did with, legislation and distracted driving awareness. Now we have a wide community of other people who we can feel more connected to. Um, but never then. And, there are a lot of times, and I know I've sat with you and always asked why, why us, why Logan, all of these things. And through the journey of healing and understanding and learning all of these, tools and healing mechanisms and ways of shifting my thought, there have been so many times, and I know people have heard me say this, that I have thought, had I known about trauma before Logan died, when I was going through what I was going through the summer of 2016, had I become aware of it prior to that, could things have been different, right? And I don't sit in that space very often, but it was through that, and then going through, the residential trauma program twice, and, learning that it takes on average 17, 18 years for someone to be diagnosed with OCD, to be like, why aren't we talking about these things in society, right? Why is it that nobody wants to talk about it? Well, damn it. I mean, and you know me very well. I'm one of those, if we're not talking about it, I'm going to talk about it, right? Someone is going to bring it to the forefront. And that is exactly what is needed for things such as what you're doing and what I'm doing. Because like you said, I always say it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you're going to lose someone, right? And unless you're taught that, unless you are made aware that that is a very likely probability in your lifetime, I mean, and I think we grow up and we're like, yeah, there's going to come a point where, my parents are going to pass away, right? That's the cycle. But never once did anybody ever say it's possible you could lose a child, and why aren't we talking about that? And why aren't we talking about, trauma and people suffering through that? So it's it's a very good point that you bring up, and it's great that the conversation is slowly starting to turn, right? Maybe back into the awareness that we had, you know, pre mid-century, mid 20th century.
There are a lot of things, that I think are happening that are positive. I also think COVID highlighted some grief pieces that people were experiencing. For example, the need for community when you lose somebody,
Hmm.
right? Um, People were so isolated, and that is even more devastating when you're experiencing this profound loss. So I do think there's some shift. My hope is that, I'm impatient in that way. My hope is that sooner rather than later, we will feel as a society a little more aware and comfortable. But our society in general is not very accepting of death. We're pretty death avoidant in terms of, it's interesting because I think about this. There's lots of images of death in the media, but we don't actually have organic conversations about
Hmm.
mortality,
Hmm.
right? We're exposed to homicides and things like that in the media. We're exposed to things in quote entertainment, movies, things like that. But when it comes to actually having authentic conversations about our own mortality, that doesn't seem to be happening. And I think that contributes to people's discomfort around other people who have experienced loss.
Agreed. And I'm sure that there are also a lot of misconceptions that people have about grief that kind of keep them from wanting to engage. Um, Over the line of your work, what are some of those misconceptions that you found people to have?
Yes. I think one misconception is that grief has some type of timeline,
Mm.
right? When we think, and this is not my concept, so I do not know whose concept this is, but I don't want to take credit for it. But the concept is most people, if you ask them to think about grief and how long that lasts, they will think it's really intense at the beginning and then it tapers off over time. There's a clear shift over time to a state of normal or a state of what you were like before, or maybe you're a little different, but grief isn't really a thing anymore, right? There's this sharp decline. And we know that's not true. So what happens is if you picture, a glass mason jar and you shove a pillow in that mason jar, there is so much pressure inside that jar, you're concerned the jar is going to break. It's going to shatter, right? That is what it is like for people when they experience loss. It is this constant tension within yourself of, I'm not sure I can survive this, and I don't know if I want to survive this, right? And what happens with grief work, time is irrelevant. It passes regardless of what we do. But what happens with grief work is the jar gets bigger. It's not that the pillow gets any smaller, it's that our capacity to carry it changes, right? It's building this resilience and this muscle to carry something. And that is what changes. The grief doesn't lessen. The amount you miss him doesn't lessen,
Mm-mm.
right? It's the capacity to hold it for a little longer and longer and longer. I'm not a runner, never have been, never will be. But I can think if I were to go outside and run today, like I would be winded within 10 seconds, right? If I keep at it and keep doing that, within a month, I could run and not be winded in 10 seconds,
Mhm.
right? It's that concept of you have to approach your grief a little bit at a time, and as you do that, your capacity to carry it changes. So I think that's probably one of the bigger misconceptions is that grief lessens with time, or grief, is really hard at first and then you're fine. But we know it's not that grief lessens, it's the capacity to carry it that changes. And I would say probably the biggest misconception people have about grief, in my opinion, is that grief is sadness. So
Mm.
if you were to ask, poll people on the street and say, what do you think the most common emotion is in grief? I think 9.9 times out of 10 you would get sadness. You might get a sprinkling, someone might say depression, right? And I would argue that sadness is an emotion people experience in grief, but it's not the dominating emotion. I believe the dominating emotion is longing. It's the one
Mm.
that never goes away.
Mhm.
You can long to go back in time and change something. You can long to speed up time and be with them. You can long to hear their voice, touch them, smell them, right? Long to go relive a certain memory with them. It is the one, it changes, but it never goes away. It is pervasive.
Absolutely. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm sitting on the other end, trying to fight tears. It's like I'm,
Yeah, it's
sitting
the one
back
that
in
doesn't go
the
away.
room talking about all I mean, it's like I'm sitting in the room talking with you about all of this again. And that's another thing, that's another misconception. It doesn't go away, right? I mean, I'm sitting here in tears
Mhm.
because speaking to you and listening to you about this brings back those fresh feelings,
Sure.
that are going to live within me forever. However, like you said, and as people have heard and understood from me, that glass jar does get bigger, right? I am always going to hear these things, and there are going to be times that it's going to, you know, evoke a reaction such as this. And people may be looking at me as if it's sadness. And that's the thing is I'm not sad. To be able to say longing, that's so important because that is, I think when you said longing, that's what triggered this emotion was thinking about, all of those things. I do long to experience, that I won't get to. Or, I used to say every year that I turned a year older, I'd look at it as a birthday that I would be, closer to seeing Logan again. And that's, so, I mean, you bring up such an important point. Longing is I had never really thought about that before, but I would support that 1,000% because I've found a place in my life where I don't usually get sad. It's thinking about what I lost out on, or, what the girls lost out on, or, not getting able to see, Logan have his own kids, or, the list goes on and on. I could name a whole bunch of them. Um, but what's interesting, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to share there was an actress who lost her, I believe it was her ex-husband and her two children in a small plane crash a few years back. And I'm going to paraphrase what she said, but I thought it was so beautiful, because in an instant, her whole family was gone, right?
Mhm.
And she said her longing feels like being homesick and knowing the exact way back to your house. You can close your eyes and you can get there, but it is permanently blocked. You will
Mhm.
never be able to go. And even though you've been there a million times, you know how to get there. It is being homesick for a place that doesn't exist anymore. And I thought that was a really beautiful, it's that longing,
Yeah.
right? Longing to go back and be in that space with them. And I'm glad that resonated with you. I think almost universally all of our bereaved parents, when they hear that, and just bereaved people in general, think, oh my gosh, yes, because it's not that I'm sad in this moment, right? Or it's not that I'm angry or feel guilt or whatever any other emotion comes up. It is just this deep longing for them.
Yeah, and
Sometimes,
always will be.
yeah. And sometimes it's also a longing, you may resonate with this. Sometimes it's a longing to just not feel this at this moment, right? To go back and not be in the space that you have lived for however many years.
Yep, there's many times I've questioned what in the world. I mean, who lives, in a type of journey that I've existed in, right? Who, and anybody can feel that, whether you've been through the trenches over and over again like I have, or you've simply lost someone. It is not very hard to question how life is like this, how it became like this. How is this my life? It's, kind of like the Talking Head song.
Right,
Um, it really is. It's like a, had you asked me when I was younger, no way. I
right,
never would have believed it.
right. And the other piece about longing that I think is misunderstood is, so we hear so often a parent will say, like, I don't care if I wake up tomorrow, or I look forward to the day I get to be reunited with them, or different iterations of that concept, right? That is not suicidal ideation. That is longing. That is the purest expression of longing to be with your child, right? And I think that gets misunderstood and people kind of panic. Um, but it really is just this eternal connection to them and a longing to be with them, right?
Yep, and I'm glad you brought that up because because, talking about suicidality and mental health awareness and grief and trauma,
Mhm.
because it's not spoken about, there is kind of a bias to hearing someone say that and think, "Oh, they just wanna die."
Right,
And, I mean, I have said those things, and I've said them because of the longing, not thinking I actually wanted to die. It's just you know, to be with them again,
right,
right? And I will also say that as time has progressed and I have healed, those words don't typically come out of my mouth
mhm,
anymore. I see that I've got, two beautiful girls and a long life to live and a lot of things to do with my life. But there are still times where I'm like, man, I I don't I will preface it and I will tell people I'm not saying that I want to die And I'm so fascinated with what's on the other side and what,
Mm,
exists on the other side and being able to see my loved ones again, that I can't wait to get there,
sure.
but not saying, I'm don't want to live another 40 years or so. It just is like you have a foot in both planes, one on this side and one on the other. And when you have lost and when you are grieving and you know that there's someone waiting for you, it's like that fine line that you literally walk on the line between this life and, where they are.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
duality.
it is duality. Something that I think is very important to talk about as well. When say a couple loses a child, you walk into it, and unless you've experienced grief or loss in some capacity before, it's not easy to understand that you and your grieving journey is going to be different than your spouse's or your children's or your other family members. Can you talk to us about your experiences and what it's been like to sit with family members who are on completely different journeys, and how does that interplay within a marriage or within a family dynamic, and what can people do if it is, that much different? Where me, I would shut down, and Jordan's comes out in many other ways, and um Mallory kind of follows my path in terms of, if we don't talk about it, then it's safer, right? If I just kind of hold it in, it's safer. Jordan is the antithesis of that. um how do you experience that with families? What kind of words of encouragement do you give for people experiencing those
Yeah.
different pathways?
It's a good question because I think that comes up so frequently for people. It's hard enough that most individuals can't predict their own grief. And now you're also trying to predict the grief of your partner and your children and manage all these pieces, right? When you don't even feel like you can appropriately predict or cope with your own grief. And so I think it depends on where people are in their journey as to how you approach it. Because I'm a big believer that what someone needs really early on in those very intense months, even first couple years, is not the same thing as what people need a few years into their journey or later in their journey, right? It shifts. What people need at one point is not necessarily what they need at another. I don't think there's an easy way for anyone to navigate a family system grieving, right? I think it takes a lot of grace, and I think it takes a lot of psychoeducation on what grief looks like for each individual person. I know, just instinctually, when someone doesn't feel good, you have less bandwidth to cope with someone else who doesn't feel good,
Right.
right? Anyone who's ever been married and dealing with a sick partner probably can relate to that. You're just like, you're fine.
Hmm.
Um, but we it's hard to show up and be compassionate when you don't even feel like you have that same compassion for yourself. A, a couple I worked with really, really early on in my career described it this way, and I thought it was a beautiful illustration. She said, I feel like I'm carrying this medicine ball around all day long, and my arms are so exhausted and they hurt. They're like on fire, screaming. And I turn to my husband to give it to him because I cannot carry it anymore. And I look and he has his own ball.
Hmm.
And she said, in that moment, I'm so angry that I can't give him the ball, and also angry that I want to give him the ball. It's this complicated feeling. So I think one thing I encourage people to do is think about where their grief symptoms are showing up the most at different points in time. So I like to organize things, and I think it can be helpful for someone who's grieving to also organize the symptoms they're having. And when you think about like dimensions of self, you have physical, mental, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual, right? Or physical, emotional, cognitive, social, and spiritual. And when you think about that, there are grief symptoms that show up in each of those dimensions. So physical could be sick to your stomach, inability to sleep, headaches, general feeling of not well, right? Those are all physical symptoms, in addition to like crying and maybe the standard ones you would think of. Emotional, those whole ranges of emotions, and again, longing is one of them, sadness can be one, guilt, relief can be one, right? There's a whole range of emotions. Social would be those awkward interactions with people, or not wanting to be around people, or not knowing how to navigate social situations. There's a whole piece in that. And also people saying inappropriate comments to you, which comes up all the time. Then you would have the spiritual piece, and that doesn't necessarily mean faith. It's just sometimes existential questions. You mentioned earlier, why, right? That goes into that spiritual realm. And, when you think about each dimension, think about where it's heaviest most. So, for example, if you are struggling to get out of bed, grief feels very, very physical. You have no energy, you need to stay in bed. A friend coming over or your partner coming to you and saying, come on, let's get up and go for a walk, you'll feel better, is a misalignment, right? That's not helpful. What could be helpful is a friend or your partner saying, what can I bring you to eat tonight so that you don't have to cook, right? Because you don't have the physical energy to cook, but we want to make sure you still get some nutrition, right? You want to match the support and the coping with the intense dimension at that moment. And sometimes it's a game, right? It's not easy because it changes so quickly. But I think when we can provide grieving individuals with some information that they can then use to say, okay, like, even if my partner can't show up for me, I can still communicate, like, physically, I can't get out of bed. And then your partner being able to recognize, okay, like, that's where they're at today, and not asking them to do more or whatever the case may be. That can create a space of being seen, feeling heard, and feeling comforted in that moment, right? Even if you can't fix it, because there is no fix. You know this,
No.
there's zero
Yep.
fix,
Mm-mm.
but you can provide moments of comfort. And that's what we're looking for. So I think that's a big piece. I think the other piece is giving each other and your children as much grace as you possibly can. A lot of people worry that, you know, am I letting my child get away with things? Or, if my partner snaps at me and I don't say something about it, like, what does that mean for me? Right. And I think we just have to recognize that most people, when they're grieving, are doing the absolute best they can do. And that even if there are less pretty moments, they're not intentional, right? It's a reflection of a hurting soul. And, I think the other piece is having some type of professional support, right? Everyone needs a space to brain dump without consequence. So when each parent has a space where they can say, this is what's going on and I'm frustrated, without the other partner hearing that information and maybe making conclusions, or in some way being hurt by that statement, right? It's really important to have that space, because otherwise then we've now created additional hurt and additional
Mm-hmm.
problems, and we
Mm-hmm.
don't want that. So I think education, I think providing each other with as much grace as possible, and then also having individual space that people can process, are really important
Well,
pieces.
and it's very interesting that you mention all that, because divorce
Mhm.
is more common than not after people lose a child, right? And I think that, or I think that it's probably a case of people not hearing that information exactly. Um, I know we didn't really know that a lot of resources existed in the time. We did do groups. We did do some individual counseling, but it wasn't until we started working with you, which was, I think 2 years after Logan passed, that we started to get that kind of information. And, the experiences that we had, before then. And I mean, and I can sit here and think of some pretty unfavorable things that had happened, well knowing that we didn't have that knowledge, right? We didn't have the knowledge, we didn't have that information. Had we have, maybe that could have, softened some things. Um, and I think it's very important for people to understand that these are the resources that are vital after, and there are times where people just don't want to even think about it or talk about it or experience it. But to think about, I mean, the point you made about, I just want to lay in bed. I don't want to be told to get up.
Mhm,
That just makes me feel worse. Like I should be,
mhm,
when what I need, I'm doing, right?
right.
Um, so if anything, bringing the awareness of these needed resources to the forefront is crucial for people to hear, for people to recognize that, there are things out there that can help you in that immediate. Of course, you have to be ready to do it. You have to be prepared. You have to be willing. There's always, you have that choice, but there are things out there for you for sure. And so transitioning then into the bulk of what you do at Riley is working with children, right? Working with families who have lost children, working with children. Um, having being an adult and understanding loss is a lot different than being a child and understanding loss. Um, in your experience, what are some of the ways that children tend to process their grief that might surprise people?
Yeah, so I think children process grief at different points in their developmental stages, right? And that's true for any life experience. When kids are going through different things, their ability to process is based on where they developmentally are, right? And so at different points in childhood and young adulthood, they will need different amounts of information. They will need different depth of explanation, right? And they will have different levels of curiosity because they can take on more, they can understand more, they can process more. So when you have really little kids, you know, we really recommend allowing them to guide how much information is given. If a child is still curious, they'll ask more questions and they'll probably ask the same question over and over again, right? That's a very different experience than a teenager who can also access independently information online or from friends, right? So we have to be mindful that it's not a one size fits all in any way, shape, or form. I will say I love Dr. Ellen Wolfelt says, if you're old enough to love, you're old enough to mourn. So if you're
Mm,
old enough to love, you're old enough to mourn, because I do believe that sometimes we dismiss our littlest ones as, well, they don't really remember them, or they didn't get to meet them at the hospital, or, a variety of things that maybe they don't understand, and therefore their grief is less. I think we also have on the opposite end of the spectrum a bit of like parentifying older kids with, how's your mom doing?
mm,
How's your dad doing? Right. And so their grief tends to get overlooked as well, just from the standpoint of people tend to ask them more about their parents than their own experience. Right. And then we hyper fixate or focus on the school age kids. So they get all the attention. But the takeaway I want people to have is to realize that kids can handle way more information than we think they can. It is the adults
mm,
that create the situation and the fear and different things like that. So if you prepare children, for example, for a funeral, of what they can expect to see and hear, smell, right? Experience. What can you expect? And what support is there if you feel overwhelmed? That is a much different experience than if we entirely shield them from it, right? I think about even with my own children, do I want them to experience difficult, traumatic, adverse things? Absolutely not. But do I know that's a part of life? Yes. So when I think about when they become adults, I want them to have a fully equipped toolbox that they go out into the world with. I don't only want them to have a hammer, which is avoidance, right? You can't do life with just a hammer. You have to have a bunch of different tools. And so, even in our own experiences, when my children have lost people they were close with, we have prepared them for that. I'll give you the example. They were very, very close with their great grandmother. She was a rock star. She lived to be 2 months shy of her 100th birthday. And we always say when we grow up, we want to be just like her. She was such a cool person. They were close with her, and she was dying. And we told them at, I want to say, so my oldest would have been around 6 years old, and my youngest would have been 4 or 5. And we told them she was dying, and we did not expect her to be with us much longer. And my son said, "Is she dead yet?" And we said, "No, she has not died." And he said, "I want to go see her." And so we prepared him for what to expect. And they climbed into bed with her and they snuggled with her, and they were not afraid because we prepared them and because we did not project that fear onto them, right? There are really great resources out there to help guide caregivers of grieving children. One of those resources is the National Alliance for Grieving Children. They have phenomenal resources. So you can find them at nacg.org. But and they have all different topics. So if you're out there and you are a parent or caregiver, or maybe you're adjacent to a parent or caregiver who has a grieving child, no, there are really great resources that you can access to equip yourself so you know how to respond, or you know how to prepare a child for a death situation or a grief experience.
And that's such an important point that you bring up is in order for us to be able to have these conversations with our children, we have to be
Mhm.
prepared with the knowledge and the understanding. For people who have not experienced grief, what would be, or the loss of a child, or preparing, a child, what would, as we sit here and we talk, I mean, most people, I'm going to project here, but I'm going to assume that most people were like us and just never thought it would happen, right? We weren't educated before it happened. You know, we'd had death in the family, but never imagined we would have something so awful happen to us. So obviously you don't prepare for it. What are outside of the Grief Alliance you were just talking about, for people who are listening and be like, maybe it would be a good idea just to start diving in, right? And maybe starting to slowly educate myself for when this could happen. What would be some other resources? I mean, do you encourage them to, talk with other bereaved parents or other, bereaved, siblings or children, or what would you encourage them to start if they want to start opening that door?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I think as organic and natural conversations you can have, the better, right? When we think about like conversations that feel like a production, like we sit down and it feels very serious, that creates awkward or odd energy, and kids pick up on that, right? So when you have opportunities, like say your children are really young, maybe they're still in the animated movie phase, you could have very organic conversations around what is being shown in the movie, right? And spoiler alert, most Disney movies involve the death of
Mhm.
so, that's a great opportunity to have an organic conversation of like, man, she must have been so sad to lose her mom and dad, or whatever the case may be, right? And start those conversations when they're little. That's a really benign, organic space to start because it's right there in front of you. So it's not like you're having to think of how am I going to introduce this concept, right? Then I think when you are a caregiver and maybe you have a loved one who has a terminal diagnosis. So say you're a caregiver and your own parents are coping with a terminal diagnosis, there are good resources out there to help prepare a child for when someone is going to die. And so I would lean into those resources. There are also really good, there are phenomenal children's grief centers all across the country. And this is their bread and butter. This is what they do is they support grieving kids. A lot of them have resources or even programming to help with anticipatory grief. So I think it's also important to reach out to local grief centers because if you think about maybe starting services when you know there's a terminal diagnosis, right? You can carry those services through when you're into that grief space. Sometimes hospices will as well, but it's kind of hit or miss on what hospices offer, but that could also be an option to explore. And, again, I'll reemphasize the National Alliance for Children's Grief is just a phenomenal organization and they have tons of resources. So, I'm a big down the rabbit hole kind of person online. So I might go to this resource and that takes me to this one and this one, right? And so you can find something specific to your situation, but I think those conversations should start when kids are young and happen organically. The other one, too, especially for kids who are maybe a little older, have exposure to things in the news, I think that's an opportunity to have a natural and organic conversation, right? So you heard this. I'm wondering how you feel about that. I'm wondering if you have any questions around that. Tell me, have you ever thought about something like that happening to someone you love, right? Really, really easy kind of entry point into that. I
All
say that, but I can talk about grief all day long.
I know, I know, I know. We could keep going for hours, right?
Right.
But that's all. I mean, that's all. You know, very great advice, or encouragement, not advice, encouragement, because and I'll say it time and time again. Had we known to be prepared, right? I feel like things could have looked different, right, on the other side, for a multitude of experiences and reasons. So that's all wonderful. Now, and talking about experiences, I know that Riley, the Riley Grief Services, doesn't just do like in-house talk therapy, which I think is phenomenal, right? Children especially need more. I mean, just as adults do, but children as well need more than just to sit and talk. And some kids won't just sit and talk. I know, our youngest is in therapy and she's 6 and she doesn't just go in and talk. She, has other activities that I'm going to let you explain what you guys do. But can you talk to me about what Riley does for grief and for children going through these types of situations that are outside of sitting and just one-on-one?
Yeah. I have to say, sometimes I have to pinch myself. We've had tremendous support from our leadership, and our hospital has really embraced supporting grieving families. We have this saying of once a Riley family, always a Riley family. And we believe our obligation to a family extends beyond the loss of a child, right? We have an obligation to make sure those families have the resources they need to navigate their grief. I often say I can't prevent the fall, but I can be a softer place to land. And so that's kind of how we approach the services that we offer. And we do have traditional grief counseling, where you would walk in and talk one-on-one with someone. But then we also offer art therapy, and our art therapists are just incredibly gifted people. I'm always amazed by the work they do with families and how powerful it is. But in addition to art therapy, we also have music therapy. So we call that creative arts therapy combined. And one of the things I think that's really important, and I know, this can be a part of anyone's grief journey, but especially when trauma is involved. Sometimes you cannot say things out loud. Even if you feel like they need to be said, it is a whole different experience to verbalize that out loud. And the beautiful thing about art and music therapy is you don't have to. You can do processing, you can do grief work and not have to say things out loud. And we have a lot of families who benefit from that, who really maybe otherwise wouldn't be able to do some of that grief work or processing if the only resource they could rely on is having to say things out loud, right? I often say there's no prize at the end for forcing ourselves to do something we're not ready to do. Even in a counseling space, forcing yourself to talk about something you're not ready to talk about doesn't result in anything better at the end. It just adds to the trauma, right? So I'm very thankful that we have art and music therapy available for families. We also have pet therapy. So there are two very sweet dogs. So we have Jasper, who's this big, lovable English lab, and you can just give him the best bear hugs. And then we have Spirit, who's in training. She's a puppy, who's this fluffy little mini Aussie doodle and just radiates joy everywhere she goes. She's always happy. And so we're very thankful and grateful to be able to offer that to families as well, because as you know, dogs just provide incredible comfort and no judgment whatsoever. They just meet you where you're at, which is beautiful. And then we have different groups that meet throughout the year. So we'll do both in-person and virtual groups. And we have special events. So one of the things that is really important for families who've lost a child is to have moments to still honor their child and still have things to do for their child, right? So we do a bereaved mother's brunch every May. We do a family picnic around Father's Day. We do a grief retreat as well that's multi-generational for families. And then we have our candle lighting every December. And the beautiful thing is we have families who have come for 10, 15 years, and they will say, this is the one thing I look forward to around the holidays because it's a chance for me to stop and do something just for this child. When everything else is about the holidays and our living children and, things like that, they get to pause and take a few hours on this day and do something that is just specific to the child they lost. So we try to have a variety of things because, again, people need different things at different points in their grief journey.
Absolutely. And I know that we've taken part in quite a bit of, in the past of some of the services. Mallory was in both the music and the art therapy. And we're going to talk to Cassie, who Mallory worked with in for art therapy. We're going to talk to her here shortly, or record with her. And there was just just so much. And I believe having Mallory involved in that at such an early age where she could play and process at the same time, or, write music and process at the same time. I mean, she went to the grief camp that you guys had and, outside of thinking she might have come home with lice, she had a wonderful time. And, um, so thank you for the services that you guys do provide. So if you are in Indianapolis, I absolutely encourage you to reach out to Liz and to the Riley program. I will include that information in the show notes and anything else Liz would like to pass along for those who are local. But I should also ask for people listening who are not local, can they still benefit from your program virtually? Or
So we can help identify resources where they are locally, right? So our services are kind of confined to the state of Indiana, but we can certainly help people try to find a resource that would meet their needs somewhere local for them. And there are more and more grief centers and therapists who work across state lines. So that's a promising thing. I can't guarantee that there's always someplace local. We've run into that even within the state of Indiana. There's nothing
Mm-hmm.
in southern Indiana, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we do try really hard to try and find something for each family, in their area if we can.
Well, thank you for extending those resources to people who aren't necessarily local. So that is definitely an important thing. And I know that Liz is absolutely true to her word. And so for anybody who, is listening and is in need of resources, you can always definitely reach out to me. I can talk to Liz, or, we can get connected, or you can reach out to Riley Grief Services and see what might be available in your area as well. So, Liz, so much gratitude.
Thank
So
you
much
for having me.
gratitude. Oh, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Um, what a wonderful way to help bring awareness into people who are grieving and people who will more than likely find themselves in a space of grief in the future. Understanding the background of how we got to where we are today, where nobody wants to talk about it, I think is essential. And like I said earlier, is something that I have carried with me, having learned from you for a long time, and is something that we've used in dialogue before, and talking about why people just don't talk about this. Nobody wants to talk about it, but it is great knowing that slowly we're starting to turn that corner, and slowly it's coming back into conversation and back into societal awareness. And I thank you and everybody there for helping spearhead that awareness and that conversation.
I would add one more thing for your listeners who maybe haven't experienced loss, but they know someone who has or is going to, or at some point you will. Don't feel like you have to know what that feels like to show up in a supportive way, right? I think we sometimes fall into the trap of like, I couldn't possibly understand. This hasn't happened to me. I have nothing to offer, right? And presence and just checking in is a beautiful gift that you can give to other people. So there's lots of good resources out there where you can learn what to say and what not to say and how to be helpful. But when you realize like my job, anyone's job as a support person is not to fix it, is to show up in a compassionate way. Hopefully that gives a little relief in knowing that you don't have to have an answer. There is no answer. You don't have to say anything. You just have to have presence. So I want to share that with people. So hopefully that empowers them to think, okay, I can be a support for someone else.
Thank you. And that is incredibly important to bring up, because having walked the journey we have and having people close to us not understand what to say, not understand how to be there, so just wouldn't be there,
Yeah.
was an add-on to the grief process. It
Yep.
just made it worse. And also I'd like to add to that, for people who do show up and just be present. If you send a text, if you call, and that person doesn't respond, please understand it's not you. It's just a space where they're existing. When I go into, certain places with my grief or hardship, I lack socially, and people will reach out and they'll ask how I'm doing, or they'll ask questions, and I may not answer. I may not respond back for a day or two or 10, and I may not answer the question. It's not because I don't want to talk to them. It's because I'm feeling so overwhelmed and so heavy by what I'm already feeling. I just need to be able to process and walk forward, because I will end up on another side and I will come back and say, thank you for checking in. I will apologize. I'll say, I apologize for not getting back to you. This was extremely heavy, but you checked in and that means the world to me. So it's kind of like this dual thing of presence is key, and please understand that if there's not a response, and there may not be for a time, it's not because of you. It's because of what the person is carrying.
I'm so glad you called that out.
Yep.
Yes,
Yep.
absolutely.
All right. Well, this has been an awesome episode. Thank you again so much for for joining us and sharing your wide breadth of wisdom. It's been good to sit across from you again and even cry in front of everyone, which you know better than anyone Brooke doesn't like to do. So see, it's just like old times.
Well, it's truly been a privilege. Thanks for having me.
Yep, thank you. And for anyone listening, again, that has questions or wants resources, I will add links into the show notes that I can get from Liz. And you can always reach out to us if you have any additional questions. Email us at hello@traumauncensored.com. And until the next episode, thank you for joining, and we'll see you then. Bye.